Brethren, we're in the process of a countdown to the next of God's annual festivals. We are approaching the halfway mark of that particular 7-week countdown. I say countdown because it is a holy day that is different from other festivals of God in the sense that it is not celebrated on a fixed date, on a particular day of the month, but rather it is a festival whose date must be calculated or counted from year to year. It is the festival that we call in the New Testament the Feast of Pentecost. It is the festival that is called in the Old Testament the Feast of Weeks, or sometimes the Feast of First Fruits Harvest. Now, it is called the Feast of Weeks, or the equivalent of that is Pentecost. Pentecost is a Greek word. You didn't know you knew so much Greek, but that's what it is. It's just a word in the Greek language that has to do with 50. Because 7 weeks were to be counted, we're told in the Old Testament in Leviticus 23 that 7 weeks were to be counted, and on the day following the 7th week. Now 7 weeks is 49 days, and the next day makes the 50th day. So, in the Old Testament it was the Feast of Weeks. 7 weeks were to be counted. In the New Testament it's commonly called Pentecost, which is the term we usually use. A count of 7 weeks or of 50 days. It began on the Sunday during the days of unleavened bread, the day that represented in Old Testament Israel the beginning of the first fruits harvest. And Israel began a countdown, a counting of week after week until finally the 7th week, the 7th Sabbath had occurred, and then the day following that was this particular festival that we call Pentecost. Now we are, as I say, almost halfway into our count because there are yet 4 Sabbaths there are yet 4 Sabbaths that are remaining, and as we by next Sabbath we will be over halfway there. Feast of Pentecost coming up in just a matter of a few weeks. We have yet 1 Sabbath in April and 3 Sabbaths in May prior to Pentecost. And as we approach Pentecost, it is appropriate that we begin to focus in on some of the lessons and some of the things God would have us understand. And by the way, while we're talking about Pentecost, let me just mention, we've not started making announcements yet, but services for Pentecost are going to be held in Lafayette. So Baton Rouge gets to drive this time. We'll give you details in subsequent weeks, but we figure that you're not the ones that are going to have to drive every time. You wind up and drive a goodly portion of the time, but we're going to have Pentecost over here. So we'll give you the details on it in the next week or two. But anyway, as we focus in, as we begin to orient our thinking toward this festival that is coming, it is appropriate that we think in terms of various of the lessons and principles connected with it. One of the things that is very much tied in with Pentecost, because it is, after all, called the Feast of First Fruits Harvest. Now, God used the agricultural cycles of ancient Israel to illustrate principles concerning His spiritual harvest. God used the physical harvest seasons as a type of the spiritual harvest in which He is engaged. Ancient Israel was called as a kind of first fruits to the Lord. We, as God's church today, are called a first fruits to the Lord. Pentecost represents a focus in on the church and on the unique mission and calling of the church. It represents the beginning of the church as a special covenant body, a group of individuals bound in covenant to God. It had its beginnings in the Old Testament with what is called the Old Covenant. It had its beginnings in the New Testament on that day of Pentecost, just a matter of 10 days after Christ's ascension into heaven. That day of Pentecost in 31 AD that's recorded in Acts chapter 2, that saw the beginning of God making a new covenant with Israel, with spiritual Israel. Now, the church had its beginnings not in the 20th century. The church didn't begin with Mr. Armstrong. The church did not even begin in Acts 2 in 31 AD. The church had its beginnings all the way back in the Old Testament period. We're going to see in Exodus 12, God first called and dealt with the congregation of Israel. God began to deal with the church, called in the book of Acts the church in the wilderness, the congregation of Israel. God began to deal with a church, and God had a reason and a purpose for calling out that church. Now, what we're going to notice is that God's commission to His church in the Old Testament was the same as His commission to the church in the New Testament. Many parallels in the commission that God gave to His Old Testament church and to His New Testament church. The Old Testament church fell short of fulfillment of the commission God had given them. The record and the example of the Old Testament church is recorded for the benefit of the New Testament church. The Apostle Paul tells us that in his letter to the Corinthians when he says these things were written down for our admonition. They were written down as examples for us. The record of God's dealing with His Old Testament church is preserved for the benefit of the New Testament church, so that we might look and see what things interfered with the Old Testament church fulfilling its calling, and that we might learn from that so that we don't fall into the same pitfalls. You know, the devil's not very original. He keeps casting the same stumbling blocks in front of God's people from the beginning all the way down till now. He really doesn't come up with too many original tactics. He uses the same old thing. Now, if we understand what it was that prevented and kept the Old Testament church from the fulfillment and the accomplishment, the achievement of the calling God had given, then we're in a position to understand more clearly the things that can also keep us from doing the things that we need to do. There are many examples, and there are many lessons. In Exodus chapter 12 and verse 3, we find Moses simply told, "Speak you unto all the congregation of Israel." This is the beginning of God dealing with a church, with a congregation. So here was the beginning of the church. The congregation of Israel, as it was called. Now, what is it that sets us apart? What do we do to come into the church? Well, based upon faith and repentance, we're baptized, right? How do you become a part of the church? Based on faith and repentance, you're baptized. Now, did God require anything similar for His Old Testament church? Well, we find the example in Exodus 12 and Exodus 13 that God required a level of faith, and he required the repentance in the physical sense. Now notice what God required. Did he require faith? Well, Exodus chapter 12, they were told in Exodus 12:12, God said, I will pass through the land of Israel this night, and I will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. The blood that shall be to you for a token upon the houses where you are, when I see the blood I will pass over, and the plague shall not be upon you. So, here, Israel was told what God was going to do. Now, faith was required, faith that included works. They had to believe that the key to survival was being under the blood of the Lamb. Because if they didn't believe what God said, and they were not under the blood of the Lamb when the death angel passed through, their homes would not have been passed over and exempted from death. Rather, So, faith was required. They had to believe God. And based on that, Exodus 13 tells us about the Exodus. Now, let's notice in Romans chapter 6 and verse 16, just hold your place in Exodus. We're going to be coming right back there. Exodus 6 verse 16 tells us, know you not to whom you yield yourselves, servants to obey, his servants you are to whom you obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. See, chapter 6 verse 1 tells us, shall we continue in sin, that grace may abound? Whoever we yield ourselves servants to, his servants we are. Now Israel had been the servants of Pharaoh. They had been servants in Egypt. Did God intend for them to stay in Egypt? No. Exodus 13 is the story of God bringing them out of Egypt. Exodus 13:3, Moses said unto the people, remember this day in which you came out from Egypt, out of the house of bondage. For by strength of hand the Eternal brought you from this place. We're told that God brought them out. God delivered them from bondage, and they followed. They came out of Egypt. They came out of bondage. They came out of sin. Egypt was a type of sin. First and foremost, they had to believe God. They had to believe in the importance of the sacrifice of the Lamb and the placing of the blood of the Lamb on their doorpost. And then they had to follow God out of Egypt. And when they followed God out of Egypt, they were led up to the Red Sea. And in Exodus 14, we find that the children of Israel, in Exodus 14:22, went into the midst of the sea upon dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. So God led them through the Red Sea. Now in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, in verse 1, moreover, brethren, I would not that you should be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea, and they were baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Now maybe you never thought of Israel being baptized, but you know to be baptized is to be immersed or plunged into water. Now, they were covered. They had water all around them. This is an example of how you can get baptized and not get wet. See, they were covered by the cloud overhead. That's water. Water vapor. They got the walls on each side. If the water had come in, they'd really been buried in it. This great, tremendous walls of water. If you've ever seen, and probably most of you have, the movie The Ten Commandments. That's one section of the movie that is very impressive. As you see the great walls of water, and you see the Israelites going over through the Red Sea. Now, They had to believe God. They had to leave Egypt. They had to leave the house of bondage. And to do so, they went through the Red Sea, which was a type of baptism. And Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10:2 that it was a type of baptism. So what we find is, at least in a physical, figurative sense, faith and repentance and baptism. Now, that, of course, is what God requires of us in the New Testament to become a part of His church. Faith, repentance, and baptism. They went through it in a physical and figurative sense. We go through it in both a literal and a spiritual way. But they were called, they were brought out, they were made a special people. They were made the congregation of Israel, God's church. They were brought to Mount Sinai, and as you trace through the account, we find in Exodus 19, verse 1, the third month, when the third month arrived. Now, Pentecost, though it is always counted, always comes in the first week of the third month. So here they came to Mount Sinai just at the time prior to Pentecost, the second of the three festival seasons. They came here to Mount Sinai, and they came on the same day of the week. We're told that they had left Egypt, which was on a Thursday. We're going to see that they were told to be ready against the third day. Friday would have been the first, Saturday the second, and Sunday, Pentecost, was the third day. This is what they were told in verse 11 of Exodus 19, which would bring them to this time that we know as Pentecost, the first celebration of the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of First Fruits Harvest. Now, God had brought them here. This was where He proposed and made the Old Covenant, and spoke the words of the Ten Commandments to them. That's recorded in Exodus 20, which was the basis of the covenant. You know, they had an ark, and it was called the Ark of the Covenant. Now, why do you call it the Ark of the Covenant? Because it was an ark or a container that contained the covenant. What was in it? The 2 tables of stone on which God had written, that contained the Ten Commandments. So the basis of the Old Covenant was the Ten Commandments, written by the finger of God on tables of stone. God called them, and what did He tell them? In Exodus chapter 19 and verse 3, Moses went up unto God, and the Eternal called to him out of the mountain, and He said, You shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. Therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. So Israel was told that God had brought them to Himself. God had brought them to enter into a special covenant relationship with Him. We're going to go in another sermon between now and Pentecost. We're going to go into the subject of covenants and understand all of the covenants, because there are more than just 2. Understand the covenants that God has made, and understand what is a covenant, and to what extent there is force and effect and validity of those covenants today. Which ones? But notice right here, it says, You keep my covenant, in verse 5, you shall be a peculiar treasure unto me. Be something very special. And You shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So this is what God called Israel to do. They were to be a peculiar people. They were to be a holy nation. They were to be a kingdom of priests. This was the commission to the Old Testament church. Notice in Deuteronomy chapter 4. Deuteronomy 4 verse 1. Hearken, O Israel, unto the statutes and unto the judgments which I teach you for to do them, that you may live. And go in and possess the land which the Lord your God, the God of your fathers, gives you. You shall not add unto the word that I command you, neither shall you diminish aught from it, that you may keep the commandments of the eternal. You've seen what the eternal did. Now notice what? Verse 5, I've taught you the statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my God commanded me, Moses tells them, that you should go into the land where you go to possess it. Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what nation is there so great, who has God so near unto them, as the Lord our God is in all things that we call upon him for? What nation is there so great and that has statutes and judgments so righteous as this law which I set before you this day? Only take heed to yourselves and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things which your eyes have seen, unless you depart from your heart, unless they depart from your heart all the days of your life. So, Israel was told that down in verse 20, the Eternal has taken you and brought you out of Egypt, out of the iron furnace, even out of Egypt, to be unto him a people of inheritance, as you are this day. Now, they were told that these commandments that they were to do, these things, this is your wisdom and understanding in the sight of the nations, in the sight of the Gentiles. They were to be a light to the world. They were to be a light to the nations. They were to set an example that the Gentile nations would look to and would see and would be so deeply impressed with the results and the consequences and the blessings that Israel had, that they would come and desire to learn of God's laws and God's truth, because they would be attracted by the light. You know, light attracts. You know, it's interesting. You put out light at night, you know, and you get moths and all kinds of things are attracted to it. You know, it's interesting. We had our camp out last weekend. By the way, I want to express appreciation to you, those of you who prayed about the weather, because everything worked out terrific. Rained and stormed all around, but we had, it was great where we were. Got to just a few minutes of a little bit of a shower earlier on in the evening. But when I say a few minutes, I mean a few minutes, you know, 10 or 15 minutes. Didn't amount to much. In fact, it had stopped by the time I got there. I'd gotten tied up in Baton Rouge and was late getting there, and it had actually stopped before I got out there. Though I drove through, boy, it was looking worse and worse. Closer I got out there, you know, lightning, you just see the whole horizon, just absolutely light. You know, it was stormy and everything. When I finally got out there to Chris Bazer's place, drove on, got out, you know, not a drop was falling. We had a very pleasant evening and morning, and everything went well. But you know, when we had wood piled up for a big bonfire. When we started the bonfire, you know, it was amazing. People kind of came out and around, and pretty soon you had people attracted to the light. Light attracts. Light attracts, unless you're up to something no good, and then light repels. You know, that's what Christ said in John. He said, you know, this is the condemnation that light has come into the world. Men love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. If you're up to something you shouldn't be, you don't like the light. You want to go, you know, get in the dark, find a dark place somewhere. But if light has a normal attraction. We're attracted to light. Israel was to be a light to the Gentiles. They were told here in Deuteronomy 4 that they were to go in, that they were to hold on to God's law, they were to live by that law. They were to live their lives by that law, and there would be blessings and benefits. And the result is, he says, this will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of all the nations. They're going to say, what nation is so great? All the nations around are going to be so impressed that they're going to want to learn. So Israel had a commission. They were to be a holy nation. They were to be a kingdom of priests. They were to be a peculiar people. They were to be a special treasure to God, the first fruits of His increase. Now, first fruits presupposes there's something else to come, else you don't have a first fruits. Jesus Christ is called the first fruits of them that slept in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul uses that and says that, the obvious implication is, if He's the first fruits of those that sleep, then the rest of us that sleep or that die are also going to come up, because He's the first fruits of those that sleep. He's called in Colossians 1:18 the firstborn from the dead, which means that we also will be born from the dead. Not a physical birth, but coming forth into a new spirit life. He's the firstborn. He's the first fruits. He went first. Now, Jeremiah 2:3 says Israel was holiness to the Lord and the first fruits of His increase. If Israel was the first fruits of His increase, that presupposes God did not intend to stop with Israel. Israel was not the stopping place, it was the starting place. The church today does not represent God's stopping place. It represents God's starting place. So Israel of old, the congregation of Israel, the Old Testament church, had a job and a commission. And it very strongly, of course, parallels our job and our commission. Because what are we told? That we are to be conscious of. Titus 2:14 talks about Christ who gave Himself for us that He might redeem us from all iniquity and purify unto Himself a peculiar people zealous of good works. Does that sound like what God said to Israel? That He might redeem us from all iniquity? Might make us a peculiar people zealous of good works? Isn't that what He told ancient Israel? What about back in Peter? 1 Peter. We're told that we're to be a holy people, a holy nation. In 1 Peter 1:15, we're to be holy in all manner of conduct. Coming on down in chapter 2, that we are to be built up, verse 5 of chapter 2 of 1 Peter, a spiritual house, a holy priesthood. Down in verse 9, we're a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of Him who has called you out of darkness and into His marvelous light. Wow, that in fact is actually taken and quoted from what we were just reading back in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. See, Peter quoted what God told the Old Testament church. Peter quoted it in the New Testament church and said that's the purpose, that's the commission, that's the job, that's the calling of the New Testament church. That's what we're all about. So God called the Old Testament church and the New Testament church, and we find the same things. Called as a chosen nation, a royal priesthood, a peculiar people, a holy nation. Called to show forth the praises of God, to live, to put the law of God into action. Jesus said to His disciples, you are the light of the world. So Israel of old was to be a light to the Gentiles. Israel, in the spiritual sense, the church, the church of God, is to be a light to the world. Now, we find that there is a similarity of commission, a similarity of responsibility. How did the congregation of Israel, what did they do? How did they respond to their commission? Well, we find that things didn't go very well. Deuteronomy chapter 31 in verse 26. Notice what Moses told them at the end of his life. He said, take this book of the law and put it in the side of the ark. Put it in the side of the ark of the covenant of the eternal your God, that it may be there for a witness against you. For I know your rebellion and your stiff neck. Behold, while I'm yet alive with you this day, you've been rebellious against the Lord. How much more after my death? So Moses said, look, he said, I don't kid myself. I know all the trouble and the headaches I've had to put up with you people while I'm alive, and I hate to think what you're going to do when I'm dead. So they weren't getting off to just a real rousing start 40 years down road from God's calling. So he told them, verse 29, he says, I know after my death you're going to utterly corrupt yourself and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days. Because you'll do evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands. Moses spoke in the ears of all the congregation of Israel the words of this song until they were ended. So chapter 32 represents a song that Moses composed that he gave. So we find that there were problems. Now, through the time that Joshua and the elders that outlived him immediately, his first couple of decades after Moses' death, things were pretty well held in check. They were held in check not because of the attitude of the people so much as the strength of God's government and the way that it was administered. You see, what we find throughout the history of the Old Testament church over and over was an alternation, was an alternating between strong government and weak government. Over and over, you find an alternation between strong government and weak government. Now, in the times of strong government, they pretty well adhered to the line because they weren't given a whole lot of choice. It was either shape up or ship out. But there were periods of weak government and periods not merely of weak government, but that even went beyond that, periods where wrong examples were set, not merely weak administration, but absolutely wrong examples. And of course, what we find is that in periods of weak government, the people departed from the law, and in periods of bad examples, they really departed from the law. So what becomes apparent as we go through is the fact of how little any of the principles of God were internalized in the lives of individuals. Now, there were individual exceptions. In the period of depravity of the judges, when even at the top of the priesthood, Eli and his sons, certainly Eli was an example of very weak government. We're not given the impression that he was himself so much personally corrupt as he was a very weak individual when it came to administering God's government. He simply put up with a lot. His sons were corrupt. Eli was weak. His sons were corrupt. And of course, weakness allows corruption to flourish and thrive. Because corruption has to be weeded out. Now, Eli administered God's government in a weak fashion. His sons were corrupt, set a horrible example, and the whole spiritual and moral and ethical life of the people deteriorated and degenerated. But even in the context of that, we find a young man by the name of Samuel that did what was right and set a good example, and people respected him. Over and over through the pages of the Old Testament, we find that even in the worst periods, there were individuals who walked with God, who were sincere in their own private personal lives, and who really did what God said regardless of what was going on around them. Now there are lessons. Judges tells us, the book of Judges in chapter 2, Judges 2:7, the people served the eternal all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord that he did for Israel. And Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died. He was 110. They buried him in the border of his inheritance. And verse 10, also all the generation were gathered unto their fathers. And there arose another generation after them which knew not the Lord, neither nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. And the children of the Lord, the children of Israel, did evil in the sight of the Lord and served Baal. We find they forsook the eternal God of their fathers that brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods, the gods of the people round about them. They forsook the eternal, verse 3, served Baal and Ashtaroth. The anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. He delivered them into the hands of the spoilers. He sold them into the hands of their enemies. And the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, verse 15. And they were greatly distressed, verse 16. The Lord raised up judges which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled. They wouldn't hearken to their judges, but they went a-whoring after other gods, bowed themselves to them, turned quickly out of the way which their fathers walked in. Verse 18, when the Lord raised them up judges, the Lord was with the judge, delivered them out of the hand of their enemies, because God felt sorry for them because of all their problems. Verse 19, came to pass when the judge was dead, they returned and corrupted themselves more than their fathers, following other gods. Verse 20, the anger of the Lord was against Israel, because they transgressed. And so ultimately we're told that in verse 21, I also will not henceforth drive out from before them the nations which Joshua left when he died, that through them I may prove Israel whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk therein as their fathers did keep it or not. Therefore the Lord left those nations without driving them out hastily, neither delivered he them into the hand of Joshua. You know why God left the Canaanites in the land? To test and prove Israel, to see what they would do. And the world, here what we notice is the very opposite. God gave Israel the law, He gave them the truth, and He said, you go and set an example and let the Gentiles be attracted to you. What did Israel do? Instead of setting an example and letting the Gentiles come to them, they went to the Gentiles. They wanted to go be like them. They wanted to become like the nations. The problem of assimilation is something that we find throughout the history of God's congregation. It's what we find in the Old Testament. It's what we find prophetically in Revelation 2 and 3. The tendency to blend in, to lose our separateness as a peculiar or special people, to lose our special identity, and to blend in with the world and to become lost. There are various groups over the years that represent that, even in terms of recent history. There's a group there are various groups that at various times split off and represented actually the bulk of the people that sort of lost their identity. We could find, as we trace back through the history of God's church, there were a group of people in the late Middle Ages, prior to the time of the Protestant Reformation. There were a group of people that represented the beginnings of the Sardis era of God's church. Many of them were known by the name in Europe of Anabaptists, which means rebaptizers, because they did not accept the christening of the Catholic Church as being of value, but rather taught the need to repent and be baptized as an adult. You can go back and you can read the story of their development. This represented the beginnings of what we know as the Sardis era of God's church. This emphasis that was stressed. Yet, as the Protestant Reformation began, what we find is that the overwhelming majority of those individuals who were a part of God's true church began to make compromises with the followers of Martin Luther and John Calvin and others, and ultimately ceased to keep the Sabbath and the Passover. That really represented the beginning of what became the Baptist church. They just simply became a part of the world, became indistinguishable, as they are today, indistinguishable from any other Protestant denomination. But represented a departure in the vast overwhelming majority. It was only the remnant that remained faithful. You could come on forward in the 18th century. The group that had come over to the United States in the 17th century, that had of the Church of God, that small remnant that had come there to Rhode Island, by the early 1800s, they had become known as Seventh-day Baptists. There is a denomination, a very small denomination to this day, known as the Seventh-day Baptist, but it represented on up into the 1800s the vast majority of God's people, those who had been a part of the Church of God, had the only thing they clung to was the Sabbath, and then that only in a very superficial way. But the Seventh-day Baptists have so lost their identity that they have simply become indistinguishable from the other Protestant denominations, with the one exception of the Sabbath, but they so watered that down that they've ceased as any sort of viable group. They assimilated in with Protestantism around them. There was a period of certain small period of revival in the churches of God around the middle of the 19th century, but ultimately, even there, the majority wound up and associated themselves with a woman, the wife of an elder, or a woman who claimed to be a prophetess, and those who followed her, which ultimately turned out to be the majority, called themselves Seventh-day Adventists. And though they started out with an association, were drawn from people who were associated with the church, they've gone further and further again to where they have virtually assimilated in with general Protestantism. You know, there was a time when they wouldn't have thought of keeping holidays like Christmas, yet today it's very commonly done. Any of you who are familiar with that church realize the extent to which gradually, one by one, the things that set them apart. The tendency is always to blend in. Mr. Armstrong came among that dead and dying remnant of the Sardis Church, the Oregon Conference of the Church of God, up in the 1920s. And God used him to raise up the next stage of God's church. You find that story, you could go through the entirety of New Testament and Old Testament history, because that's the tendency of human nature. The tendency of human nature is to slow down. The tendency of a fire is to burn down. You've got to stir it up. We have to continually stir up the gift of God that is within us. Israel was set to be a light to the nations, but instead of being a light to the nations, they left aside what they were doing and went after what the nations were doing. This is the story you find right here. This summarizes the book of Judges, the account there. The only time, there was a very brief period of time when Israel functioned to at least some extent as God had intended. And this was the period of King David. The latter part of David's reign, the early part of Solomon's reign, is the only period of any consequence when Israel sort of did what they were called to do. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, in verse 14, we find that Saul was told, "Your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought him a man after his own heart. The Lord has commanded him to be a captain over his people, because you haven't kept that which the Lord commanded." So, over and over, you see, when those who were in a responsible position did not follow through, ultimately, God raised up someone who would be faithful. He raised up David, replaced Saul, because Saul would not follow through. Now, David set the stage, and in the very early years of Solomon's life, notice what Solomon did. Let's notice in 1 Kings 4. 1 Kings 4:29. God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding exceeding much, and largeness of heart even as the sand which is on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom excelled all the wisdom of all the children of the east country and all the wisdom of Egypt. Solomon had greater wisdom than all of the supposed great wisdom of the east. You know, people want to look for something in some obscure place. Well, the place to look is the Bible. That's where you find wisdom. Solomon had more wisdom than all the children of the East and all the children of Egypt. He was wiser than all men. And it names all various ones, Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman and Calcol and Darda, the sons of Mahal, and his fame was in all nations round about. He spoke 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that's in Lebanon to the hyssop that springs out. Well, he spoke of beasts and of fowl and creeping things and fishes. Solomon was a student. He was a student of science. He studied botany. He studied zoology. He studied every sort of subject. He was a poet. He was a songwriter. He was a compiler of proverbs. And there came, verse 34, of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon from all the kings of the earth which had heard of his wisdom. Now we have what God said. He said, if you keep my laws, it's going to be your wisdom in the sight of all the nations. For a brief period of time, here was an example being set, and what do we find? All the nations round about began to send emissaries. You know, that's what's going to happen at the beginning of the millennium. Finally, when Israel has learned its lesson and God regathers them and they're established there in Jerusalem, what are we told? We're told that the nations round about will say, come, let us go up to the God of Jacob and he will teach us of his ways. The nations round about, the Gentiles, are going to look to what's going on in Israel regathered after the tribulation, after the return of Christ. They're going to look to that and they're going to say, hey, we want what you have. And so we're told in Isaiah that they're going to say, come, let us go up to the house of the God of Jacob. He'll teach us of his ways. We want to learn what these people know. And at that time, Israel is going to begin, finally, the fulfillment of the commission that God gave them. But what we have here, you see, as we go on through the things that were there, that Solomon, we're told in verse 24 of chapter 5, he had peace on all sides round about. We find that there was peace, there were benefits, there were many things that were going on. And people came and they sought to come up. We're told in chapter 10 of 1 Kings that the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, and she came to prove him with hard questions. Came to Jerusalem with a very great train. And in verse 6 of chapter 10, she said to the king, it was a true report that I heard of in my own land of your acts and of your wisdom. She ruled over an area that consisted of, Sheba was, she was the ancestor of the royal line of Ethiopia. This was in the area down of what is today northern Ethiopia, southern Sudan. It actually included even a tip of the Arabian Peninsula over there by Yemen and Aden, where the Eritrean Civil War is going on down in Ethiopia now. This is the area. So here was an area to the south of Egypt here was a queen that heard of Solomon's wisdom. And she came from a long journey. And she was deeply impressed. This is a fulfillment, you see, of what was intended. She said in verse 7, she said, I didn't really believe all the things I heard. But now I see that what is here is even greater. Verse 8, happy are your men, happy are these your servants, which stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, which delights in you to set you on the throne of Israel, because the Eternal loved Israel forever, and he made you king to do judgment and justice. She was very impressed. One of the things she noticed was how happy the people were at Solomon's court. She noticed that. She was impressed by the attitude of the people that she saw. There was a time of peace. It was a time of prosperity. It was a time of happiness. It was a time of blessing. But what happened? Chapter 11 tells us King Solomon loved many strange women. He got tangled up. He had a problem. He had a weak spot. And all his wisdom didn't do him a whole lot of good. because he began to get tangled up in various relationships with women of other nations, and the thing that God had told him not to do, he did. And so we find that Solomon turned more and more away from God and became more and more entangled in trying to please all of these women and to gain their favor, until he wound up obsessed with that. And, of course, the situation deteriorated. In verse 14 of 1 Kings 11, the Lord stirred up an adversary for Solomon. In verse 23, the Lord stirred up another adversary. And finally, Solomon died. And chapter 12 is very crucial. Because after Solomon's death, Rehoboam went to Shechem. All Israel was come to Shechem to make him king. And Jeroboam, who had had to flee during the time of Solomon, came with a delegation, and they demanded lower taxes. And this was the original tax revolt, that they said, lower our taxes, and instead of Rehoboam making a pledge, you see, of no new taxes, read my lips, and then turning around and raising them a little later after things calmed down, he wasn't that smart. He was not a real smart politician. He just blatted out what he intended to do, and threatened them and said, well, I'll raise the taxes if I want to. If you don't like it, I'll be rougher on you than my dad was. So they just said, well, if you raise them on somebody else, we're going to get a new king. And they left. And so the 10 tribes rebelled against Rehoboam, and if God hadn't had mercy in terms of honoring the promise he had made to King David, Rehoboam would have lost the whole thing. But he held on to Jerusalem, to Judah and Benjamin. And in chapter 13, what we find is then in chapter 12, Jeroboam, who goes up north, Jeroboam, who becomes king over northern Israel, establishes his own religion. He builds 2 golden calves. And he says, look, we're going to have a convenient religion. I'm going to put 1 calf up north in Dan, 1 down south in Bethel, so everybody doesn't have to go to the same place. You don't have to go to the trouble and the inconvenience of going all the way down to Jerusalem for the feast. You can come here to Dan and to Bethel and worship these 2 golden calves. After all, that's biblical, isn't it? Worshiping golden calves. Didn't our ancestors do that? Back in Mount Sinai? A lot of things are biblical, but it's what does the Bible say? That's the key. Sometimes people say, well, that's in the Bible. Well, sure. A lot of things are in the Bible, but sometimes what's in the Bible about them is that you shouldn't do it. And that Jeroboam kind of overlooked, see? So we come on down through the story that the stage was set and the kingdom split. Jeroboam made a paganized version of the truth the official religion. Israel never again returned to the true God. Now things went worse because, if anything, Jeroboam still paid lip service to the God of Israel, and he clung to at least a few of God's laws, but he introduced idolatry, and he changed some of the festivals around, and he did sort of his own thing, made his own brand of religion, but it was sort of a blend. Now by the time we get to 1 Kings 16, we find that Omri becomes king in verse 23. Omri was famous and gave his name to this dynasty that ruled. We don't usually. Omri was of great fame and great note in the ancient world. In fact, the dynasty that he established was noted to the point that some of the foreign nations actually referred to Israel as the house of Omri. In fact, the term Cimmerians, which is the term that the Celtic peoples who migrated into Europe up into northern France and into portions of the British Isles, the Celtic peoples, known as the Cimmerians, that name actually comes from the Assyrian word house of Omri, is what is described. That's the name that's actually used on the Assyrian monuments when Israel was deported. But Omri, we don't read a whole lot of in the Bible. The main thing Omri, from a biblical standpoint, what we take note of Omri on is he built Samaria and he had a son by the name of Ahab, who married that sweet, charming Jezebel. And that set the stage for the confrontation with Elijah. But Jezebel did something else. She was the daughter of the king of Sidon, and she introduced Baal worship. Now, the worship of the golden calves was bad enough, but she brought in Baal worship and all of that. And so the situation in Israel went from bad to worse. As you come on down, that you could go through the account here, and you remember the story of Elijah and all of these things. Finally, there was a sort of a reform. We read of in 2 Kings 9 and 10. This was sort of the original Protestant Reformation. You didn't know that started way back then. Ancient Israel had a Protestant Reformation way back when. They stirred up. Jehu was chosen to be the king, and by Elisha. And Jehu's main job was to get rid of the house of Omri, to get rid of Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab was dead, but he was going to get rid of Jezebel. So Jehu came riding up, and you can read the story in 2 Kings 9, how Jehu killed the son of Ahab and Jezebel, who was currently the king, and then comes riding on into town. And in verse 30, when Jehu was come to Jezreel, Jezebel heard it, and she painted her face and tired her head and looked out the window. She figured, she was up to her old tricks again. And Jehu was not to be impressed. He called out and said, "Who's on my side?" And a couple of the servants up there pitched her out the window, which was what Jehu told them to do, throw her down. So they threw her down, very gruesome account. Jehu was not a particularly sensitive individual. He went in and ate his meal, and after he finished, he got to thinking about maybe they ought to go bury Jezebel, but the dogs had beat him to her. And that account is given in detail right here in the last few verses of chapter 9. A very gruesome and a very horrible end. Here was a woman who ended in this fashion. God had decreed it so. She was an individual whose beauty was purely external and not at all internal. Her beauty was something that was put on and taken off, and she was, in fact, in verse 22, was noted for her whoredoms and her witchcrafts. Is actually a type of the great whore of Revelation 17. Is actually that pattern. She was notorious for committing fornication with the kings of the earth. That's the way that she built alliances. Well, she had a very horrible death for someone who in God's sight was a very horrible person. Well, in chapter 10, old Jehu comes on. Ahab had 70 sons. Jehu killed them all. He was a sort of a bloodthirsty sort of character. Comes on down in verse 11. He slew all the kinfolks of Ahab, and then he met some of the brothers of some of the relations of the king of Judah. Now, the kings of Judah and Ahaziah, the king of Judah, had married into what was actually the daughter, or the granddaughter, or the grandson of Jezebel. His mother was Jezebel's daughter. So some of the relatives came in, and this was another branch of the family, and they were at the wrong place at the wrong time. You talk about poor timing. They were showing up, coming to visit. See, they didn't realize that a revolt had taken place, and so Jehu sees them, and he says, "Where are you going?" He said, "Oh, we're coming up to see our kinfolks over there, the children of the king, the children of the queen." And Jehu said, "Take them out and shoot them too." They didn't shoot them; they chopped them up. But anyway, so then he meets up with one of God's servants, Jonadab, and he says, verse 16, "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord." Now, Jehu was zealous when he thought it suited his purposes. So they got in the chariot and they took off. And as they came on in, Jehu said, we're having a big party. We're having a big get-together for everybody that worships Baal. We're going to get everybody together that worships Baal. We're going to really have a big celebration for Baal. So he got everybody in there, told the priests of Baal, he says, check it out. We don't want any interlopers in here. We want to make sure everybody is here to worship Baal. So they were all convinced. They had them all. They were all here. They're going to have this big thing for Baal. Jehu stepped out, sent the army in, and wiped out the whole place. So he wiped out Baal worship. But what did he do? He burned the images of Baal, we're told in chapter 10, verse 26, destroyed Baal out of Israel, verse 28. But in verse 29, from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, Jehu didn't depart. He didn't leave the golden calves. He didn't really return to God. He just sort of had a Protestant Reformation against the Baal worship that was extant. He just toned down and got rid of a lot of the things, a lot of the trappings of the Baal worship, but he really didn't turn back to the truth. It was sort of a watered down, weak approach. What we find is that there was Israel never returned. Israel never really returned. In verse 32 of 2 Kings 10, in those days the Lord began to cut Israel short. Began the period of decline that ultimately led into Israel going into captivity. Now Judah to the south did have periods of up and down. Judah to the south did have periods of serving God and periods of turning away from God. Israel never returned to true service of God from the time of King Jeroboam. Over and over and over, what we find is the church lost sight of its commission. The church, the congregation of Israel, lost sight of its commission to be a light to the Gentiles, to be a peculiar people, a holy nation, a nation of priests. They lost sight that they were to observe God's law, and that was to be their wisdom in the sight of the nations. They did their own thing. And you can go through the story, and there are many details I don't have time to go into. You know, Judah went through its period of ups and downs, the period of the kings, the ups and downs, the heavy pagan influence, the periods of reform, which were only surface. There were times when certain kings reformed and were strong kings and exercised government strongly, and people kind of fell into line behind them. But there was no real turning to God with the heart. Ultimately, Judah also went into captivity. They came back, and first Zerubbabel led them back, and then later Ezra and Nehemiah came in. Constantly this battle to turn back and to focus in on obeying God. But it never lasted for any time. Never lasted long enough for them to really begin to fulfill that commission. By the time of the New Testament period, there was only left a hollow shell, form without substance, narrow, exclusivist, having a form of godliness but denying the power thereof. That was the state of things at the time of the Pharisees when Christ dealt with them, those who sat in Moses' seat of his day. Now, we have this example. Over and over and over, we find what the congregation of Israel did. And their problems of faithfulness to God and of keeping their eyes on the job that God had called them to do. God today is dealing with His church, and God's church is spiritual Israel. There is physical Israel and there is spiritual Israel. And there are certainly physical promises and physical things that deal with the physical descendants of Abraham, but in the spiritual sense, there is a spiritual Israel. In Romans chapter 11, it talks about God's people, and it talks about how that ultimately, from a spiritual standpoint, the Gentiles are grafted in to become a part of spiritual Israel. You know, what are we told in Galatians 3:29? That if you are Christ, then are you Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. When you come into the church, when you're converted, regardless of your ethnic background, to follow the analogy of Romans 11, you are grafted on to the stock of Israel from a spiritual standpoint. Spiritually, you become a part of the first fruits, the spiritual first fruits. If you're Christ, you're Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So from a spiritual standpoint, there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Gentile. Obviously, physically, we are what we are, whether from a standpoint of male and female or a standpoint of our ethnic background. But from a spiritual standpoint, before God and in terms of the plan and the purpose that God is working out to bring all into His family, God's church, regardless of the background, because God has called His church out of all nations and has grafted them on as a part of spiritual Israel. And if you're Christ, then are you Abraham's seed? He talks about it in Ephesians 2. How you who were strangers and aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and from the covenants of promise now have been made a partaker of it. And you go through the example there in Ephesians chapter 2. We are called to do a job that parallels that of ancient Israel. We read it in 1 Peter chapter 2, where we see that we are to be a royal priesthood, a holy nation. That we are to be a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. 1 Peter 2:9, that we should show forth the praises of Him who has called us out of the darkness and into His marvelous light, which in times past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul. Have your conduct honest among the Gentiles. We are to set an example, to follow the example Christ set. Verse 21, He suffered for us, and He left us an example we should follow in His steps. We need to recognize our calling, that we are to exemplify God's way of life. We are to be a light to the world. We are to look at the example of our spiritual forebearers, the example of ancient Israel, the example of the congregation of Israel, the church in the wilderness, is written down and preserved for our benefit. We're told in 1 Corinthians 10:11 that these things happened unto them for examples. And they're written down for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the age are come. Wherefore let him that stands, that thinks he stand, take heed, lest he fall. There is no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. The problems we're going to run up against are the problems they ran up against. They're the problems human beings run up against. But God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tested above your ability to resist. We're told to flee idolatry, to flee compromise with the world, to flee the things that draw us into losing our identity as Israel of old lost theirs time after time. These things that are happened to them, the things, the examples and record of the Old Testament church, are examples for us. They're written down and they're preserved for our benefit so that we can read it, because we have to be careful, not just think we stand. He that thinks he stands better take heed lest he fall. The temptations that take us, the temptations that beset us, are the temptations that have beset God's people through the centuries. The key to avoiding the succumbing to those temptations is to draw nigh to God, to walk with God, draw close to Him. God is faithful. He will make us stand if we draw close to Him and we walk with Him and we drink in of His Word and of His Spirit. And we recognize the importance of fleeing from idolatry, fleeing from the polluting influences of the world. Let's not see how close to the world we can get. Let's see how close to God we can get. Because, brethren, these things are written for our admonitions, upon whom the ends of the age are come.